The sky above Vathra Prime burned orange and red as the capital city fell into ruin and chaos all around Commander Lyris Vian. And she knew in her heart that this was the end of everything she had ever known or believed in. She knelt in the ruins of her command center with her iridescent wings torn and bloodied from the battle that had raged for 3 terrible days and nights without rest or mercy from either side. Her crystalline armor lay shattered around her like broken dreams, and the bodies of her loyal soldiers covered the ground in every direction she looked. The Vathran Empire had ruled this sector of space for 10,000 years, conquering dozens of species and building a civilization based on strength and dominance over all weaker beings. But now that empire was crumbling, and the ones responsible for its destruction were the species that everyone had laughed at just 2 centuries ago when they first appeared on the Lilith galactic stage. The humans had come. Lyris remembered the warnings that the Galactic Concord had sent to her emperor just 5 years before this day, and she remembered how the entire royal court had laughed at those warnings. Do not provoke the humans, the Concord ambassador had said with fear in his many eyes, for they are not like other species, and they do not forget when they are wronged. But the Vathran Empire had not listened because they believed themselves to be the greatest power in the galaxy, and they saw humans as nothing more than soft and fleshy primitives who had barely learned to travel between stars. The Empire had raided human colony ships and taken their people as slaves to work in the crystal mines of the outer worlds. The Empire had burned human settlements on 3 different planets just for the sport of watching the flames rise into the sky. The Empire had laughed and celebrated each victory over these weak creatures who seemed so fragile compared to the mighty Vathrans with their armored skin and powerful wings. And then the humans had responded. Lyris would never forget the day when the human fleet appeared in Vathran space. Thousands of warships emerging from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. Like a wall of metal and fury, the war had lasted only 8 months. And in that time, the humans had systematically destroyed every military installation the Empire possessed. They did not negotiate or ask for surrender terms until every Vathran weapon was silenced and every fleet was reduced to floating debris. Now Lyris knelt alone in the ashes of her command center, the last surviving officer of the 3rd Fleet, waiting for the death that she knew was coming for. The sound of heavy boots crunching through rubble made her lift her head, and she saw a single human soldier walking toward her through the smoke and fire. His armor was scarred from battle, and his rifle was raised and pointed directly at her chest, and his face was hidden behind a tactical visor that showed nothing of what he might be feeling. Behind him, more human soldiers spread out through the ruins, securing the area and checking bodies for survivors. Soldiers stopped 3 meters away from Lyris and stood there in silence for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then his translator device crackled to life, and his words came through in perfect Vathran language, cold and precise and cutting straight into her soul. "You are Commander Lyris Vian of the 3rd Fleet," he said in a voice that carried no emotion at all. "And you are the one who ordered the attack on Harvest Colony 6 months ago." Lyris felt her blood turn cold because she knew exactly what he was talking about. Harvest Colony had been a human agricultural settlement on a small moon in the outer territories, home to 3,000 civilians who grew food for nearby mining operations. Lyris had received orders from the High Command to make an example of the humans, to show them that their kind would never be safe anywhere in Vathran space. She had followed those orders without question or hesitation. Her ships had bombarded the colony from orbit until nothing remained but craters and ash, and she had watched the destruction on her view screen while drinking a glass of sweet wine. 3,000 humans had died that day, including 400 children who had been attending school when the first plasma beam struck the surface. Yes, Lyris said, because there was no point in lying when the end was so near. I gave that order and I watched it happen, and I felt nothing but satisfaction at the time. The human soldier was silent for another long moment, and Lyris could feel the weight of his judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. She had seen what humans did to those who harmed their people, and the stories had spread throughout the galaxy like dark legends whispered in fear. The Krovax hegemony had attacked a single human world without warning 50 years ago, killing 10,000 civilians in a surprise assault. The humans had responded by hunting down every Krovax ship and colony until not a single member of that species remained alive. Anywhere in the known universe, they had erased an entire civilization from existence because of one attack. And they had done it with cold and methodical precision that terrified every other species in the Concord. Lyris knew that she deserved whatever fate awaited her, and she would not beg or plead for mercy that would never come. She closed her eyes and straightened her spine and waited for the plasma shot that would end her life. One heartbeat passed in darkness, then another and another. The shot never came. Instead, Lyris heard a sound that made no sense to her at all. The rustle of fabric and the click of armor being removed. Something soft and warm pressed against the deep gash on her shoulder, and her eyes flew open in shock and confusion. The human soldier had knelt beside her and removed his helmet, revealing a face that was lined with exhaustion and covered in dust and dried blood from the battle. He was pressing a medical bandage against her wound with careful and gentle hands, and his eyes held an expression that Lyris could not identify or understand. "What are you doing?" she asked in a voice that came out as barely more than a whisper. The human looked at her with those strange soft eyes that seemed to hold something she had never seen in any Vathran face. "You are injured," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "And the war is over now. But I killed your people," Lyris said, with confusion flooding through her mind. "I killed thousands of your people, and I did it without mercy or regret." The human continued wrapping her wound with steady hands that did not shake or hesitate. "I know," he said quietly, "but killing you will not bring them back. And this war has seen enough death already." He finished the bandage and sat back on his heels, looking at her with that unreadable expression still on his face. "My name is Sergeant Marcus Cole," he said, "and you are now a prisoner of the United Nations of Earth." Lyris stared at him as her entire understanding of the universe shifted and cracked around her like breaking glass. She had been prepared for death and had accepted it as her fate. She had not been prepared for this. The human ship that carried Lyris away from the burning ruins of her homeworld was called the UNSS Meridian, and it was larger than any vessel she had ever seen in her long military career. It stretched across space like a small moon made of metal and light, carrying thousands of human soldiers and hundreds of prisoners from the conquered Vathran worlds. Lyris had expected to be thrown into a dark cell and left to rot until her execution date arrived, because that was what the Vathran Empire did to captured enemy commanders. She had expected torture and interrogation and pain beyond anything she could imagine, because that was what her own people did to extract information from their prisoners. Instead, she was given a private room with a soft bed and a large window that looked out at the endless stars. The room had a small table and a chair and a screen on the wall that could display entertainment programs from human culture if she wished to watch. Then she was given 3 meals every day, and the food was strange but filling and prepared with care that she did not understand. On the second day, a human doctor came to visit her. The doctor was a small woman with black hair and dark eyes and a gentle smile that seemed completely out of place on the face of an enemy. Name was Yuki Tanaka, and she spoke to Lyris in a soft voice that held no anger or hatred at all. "I am here to check your wounds and see how you are healing," Dr. Tanaka said as she opened a medical kit and began examining the gash on Lyris's shoulder. Why? Lyris demanded, because she could not understand any of this strange behavior. Because you are injured, and I am a doctor. Yuki replied with a small shrug as if the answer was obvious. And my job is to help injured people get better. But I am your enemy, Lyris said, with frustration building in her chest. I killed thousands of your kind and ordered the destruction of your colony and felt no regret. Dr. Tanaka paused in her work and looked at Lyris with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her. You were a soldier following orders in a war, she said quietly. And now that war is over and you are a patient in my care. She returned to her examination and began scanning Lyris's wing membranes with a small device that hummed softly. Your wings were badly damaged in the battle, the doctor said in a professional tone. But I believe we can repair them with surgery if you agree to the procedure. Lyris stared at her in complete shock because this made no sense at all. You want to fix my wings? She asked in disbelief. You want to restore my ability to fly even though I am a war criminal who massacred your people? Yes, Dr. Tanaka said simply, because medical care should not be denied based on what someone has done, and because healing is always better than leaving someone broken. The doctor finished her examination and packed up her kit with careful movements. I will return tomorrow to check on you again, she said as she walked toward the door. And if you need anything before then, you can press the button beside your bed and someone will come. She paused at the doorway and looked back at Lyris with something that might have been sadness or pity or something else entirely. I know you do not understand why we are treating you this way, Yuki said softly, but maybe in time you will. Then she was gone and Lyris was alone with her confusion and her thoughts that would not stop racing through her mind over the next several days. Lyris began to see more of how the humans treated their prisoners. She was allowed to walk through certain areas of the ship under guard, and she watched as other Vathran prisoners received the same medical care and food and basic dignity that she had been given. She saw human soldiers sharing meals with captured enemies and even laughing together at jokes that crossed the language barrier. She saw prisoners being interviewed by human officials who asked questions without violence or threats. Simply writing down answers and moving on to the next person. Word began to spread through the Concord about what the humans were doing, and Lyris heard fragments of these reports through the ship's news broadcasts. The humans are processing war criminals through a formal legal system, one Concord reporter announced with audible confusion in his voice. And they are releasing prisoners who merely followed orders without committing specific atrocities. Human forces are rebuilding infrastructure on conquered Vathran worlds, another report stated. And they are providing food and medical supplies to enemy civilians who were starving. The Galactic Concord held an emergency session to discuss these strange developments. And Lyris watched the broadcast from her room with growing disbelief. Ambassador Vorix of the Selenith Collective spoke first, his tentacles waving in agitation as he addressed the assembly. The humans had the power to completely annihilate the Vathran species, he said in a voice that trembled with uncertainty. And yet, they chose not to use that power. This must be some kind of deception, another ambassador argued. Some elaborate trick to make us lower our defenses before they strike. Or perhaps, a third voice suggested quietly, the humans are something that we have never encountered before in all our long history among the stars. The debate raged on for hours, but no one could explain what the humans were doing or why they were doing it. Lyris lay on her bed that night and stared at the ceiling of her room while her mind struggled to process everything she had seen and heard. Vathran Empire had conquered dozens of species over 10,000 years, and they had always followed the same pattern. The strong took what they wanted from the weak, and the defeated were either enslaved or destroyed. And mercy was a weakness that led only to ruin. This was the natural order of the universe, the fundamental law that governed all interactions between civilizations, or at least that was what Lyris had always believed, but the humans were not following that pattern at all. They had won the war completely and utterly, crushing the Vathran military with terrifying efficiency and precision. They could have done anything they wanted to the survivors, and no one in the galaxy would have blamed them after what the Empire had done to their colonies. Instead, they were healing wounds and feeding prisoners and rebuilding cities and treating their defeated enemies with a strange and incomprehensible respect Lyris did not understand. And that lack of understanding frightened her more than any threat of death or torture ever could. Because if the humans were not acting out of deception or strategy, then they were acting out of genuine principle and belief, and that meant everything Lyris had been taught about the universe was wrong. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with images of burning colonies and crying children, and a human soldier who had chosen to heal instead of kill. When she woke the next morning, Dr. Tanaka was there again with her medical kit and her gentle smile. "Good morning," the doctor said cheerfully. "I have good news about your wings." And Lyris realized that she wanted to live long enough to understand what kind of species could show mercy to someone like her. 6 months after the war ended, Lyris Vian was brought to Nexus Station to stand trial for her crimes against humanity and the galaxy at large. Nexus Station floated in neutral space between a dozen star systems, a massive structure built by the Galactic Concord centuries ago as a place where different species could meet and conduct business without conflict. Now it served as the location for the Interstellar Crimes Tribunal, a joint court established by humans and the Concord to process war criminals from the Vathran conflict. Lyris walked through the corridors of the station with guards on either side of her, her repaired wings folded tight against her back and her head held high despite the shame that burned in her chest. She had expected this day to come, had prepared herself for the moment when she would face judgment. For the things she had done, she expected fury from the humans who had lost loved ones to her orders. She expected a mob of angry survivors calling for her blood and her death. She expected to be condemned quickly and executed before the sun set on this strange artificial world. What she did not expect was the man who met her outside the courtroom doors. He was tall with dark skin and graying hair at his temples, and he wore formal clothes that marked him as some kind of legal official. "Commander Vian," he said in a calm and measured voice that carried no anger. "My name is David Okonkwo, and I've been assigned as your defense attorney." Lyris stared at him in complete confusion, because surely she had misheard his words. "My defense attorney?" She repeated slowly. "You are a human, and you are going to defend me in court?" "Yes," David said with a small nod. "That is exactly what I am going to do." "But why?" Lyris demanded as her confusion turned to something close to anger. "I killed your people and destroyed your colony, and I did it without hesitation or mercy." David looked at her with steady eyes that held no hatred and no fear. "Because everyone deserves a fair trial," he said simply. "Even you, especially you. And that is the entire point of what we are doing here." He gestured for her to follow him into a small side room where they could speak privately before the trial began. The Vathran Empire believed that might makes right, David explained as they sat across from each other at a simple table. And they believed that the strong could do whatever they wanted to the weak without consequence. He folded his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "Humans believe something different," he continued. "We believe that justice must be applied equally to everyone regardless of their power or position, even to your enemies." Lyris asked with disbelief thick in her voice. "Especially to our enemies," David replied. Because if we abandon our principles when dealing with those we hate, then those principles meant nothing in the first place. The trial began 1 hour later, and Lyris sat in the defendant's position with David beside her as the evidence was presented to the court. The courtroom was filled with beings from a dozen different species, all watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to horror to complete bewilderment. Human prosecutors presented records of the Harvest colony attack, showing video footage of the bombardment and the aftermath of destruction. They called witnesses who had survived by being away from the colony on that terrible day. People who had lost everyone they loved in a matter of minutes. Lyris watched and listened as humans took the stand one by one, and she waited for them to scream at her and demand her death. But they did not scream. Instead, they shared their grief in quiet voices that somehow cut deeper than any angry shout ever could. A woman named Sarah Chun spoke about losing her husband and 2 children who had been eating breakfast when the first plasma beam struck. "I want to know why," she said while looking directly at Lyris with tears streaming down her face. "I just want to understand why you did this to us." Lyris had no answer that would satisfy her, because Lyris did not fully understand her own actions anymore. Old man named Robert Martinez told the court about his daughter, who had been a teacher at the colony school, how she had loved children and spent her life trying to help them learn and grow. She was 32 years old, he said in a voice that trembled with old pain, and she never hurt anyone in her entire life. The testimonies continued for days, and Lyris heard story after story of lives destroyed and families shattered by her single order. But not one of those witnesses demanded her execution. They asked for justice, and they asked for understanding, and they asked for answers. But they did not ask for revenge. David Okonkwo presented her defense with skill and care, arguing that Lyris had been following orders from her military command, and that she had been raised in a culture that taught her to see humans as lesser beings. He did not excuse what she had done, but he provided context that helped explain how a person could commit such terrible acts. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and when it was finally over, Lyris stood to hear her sentence. The Chief Justice was a human woman with silver hair and a face lined with years of difficult decisions. "Lyris Vian," she announced in a voice that filled the entire courtroom. "This tribunal finds you guilty of crimes against sentient life and violations of basic moral principles shared by all civilized species." Lyris lowered her head and accepted the verdict because she knew it was true. However, the Chief Justice continued, "The sentence of this court is not death." A murmur of shock rippled through the courtroom, especially from the Concord observers who had expected an execution. "You are hereby sentenced to supervise rehabilitation and community service for the remainder of your natural life," the justice declared. "You will help rebuild what you destroyed, and you will learn what you failed to understand." Lyris looked up in shock as the words washed over her like a wave of cold water. "You are being given a chance to become something more than what you were," the justice said directly to her. "And whether you take that chance is entirely up to you." In the gallery, she saw Sergeant Marcus Cole watching her with that same unreadable expression he had worn on the day they first met. He nodded once, and Lyris felt something shift inside her chest. She had been prepared to die for her crimes. She had not been prepared to live with them, and somehow that was a far more difficult sentence than any execution could ever be. 5 years had passed since the trial, and Lyris Vian had become someone she no longer recognized when she looked in the mirror. Each morning, she lived now in a small house on the edge of the agricultural district of New Harvest, a human colony built on the same moon where she had once ordered the deaths of 3,000 innocent people. The humans had given her this assignment as part of her sentence, sending her to work among the very people she had tried to destroy. It. First, she had thought this was their way of punishing her, forcing her to live among those who had every reason to hate. her with every fiber of their beings. Now she understood that it was something far more complex and far more difficult than simple punishment. Every day she woke before sunrise and walked to the fields where she worked alongside human farmers, planting seeds and harvesting crops and doing the endless task that kept the colony fed. Her wings had been fully healed by human doctors, who asked for nothing in return, and she could fly again whenever she wished, but she rarely flew anymore because the freedom of soaring through the sky felt like something she had not earned and did not deserve. The first year had been the hardest because many humans in the colony could not look at her without seeing the face of the one who had murdered their families and friends. Some of them spat at her when she walked through the streets. Others refused to speak to her or even acknowledge that she existed. One man had thrown a rock at her head and called her a monster and a murderer, and Lyris had simply stood there and accepted his hatred because she knew that he was right. She did not fight back, and she did not defend herself because there was nothing she could say that would undo what she had done. But slowly, painfully, things began to change. A farmer named James Harrison was the first to speak to her beyond simple work instructions, asking her about Vathran agriculture and whether her people had different techniques for growing crops. Lyris had answered honestly and shared knowledge from her homeworld, and James had nodded and thanked her and returned to his work. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a door opening, just a tiny crack. More conversations followed over the months and years, as humans began to see her as a person rather than just a symbol of their suffering. She learned their names and their stories and their strange customs that made no sense to her at first. She learned about their holidays where they celebrated family and gratitude and the simple joy of being alive. She learned about their music that ranged from soft and gentle to loud and wild, expressing emotions she had never been taught to feel. She learned about their peculiar love for small furry animals called dogs that served no practical purpose except to provide companionship and affection. A human woman named Elena adopted one of these creatures and let Lyris pet its soft fur one afternoon, and Lyris had felt something warm bloom in her chest that she did not have a name for. She attended the memorial services for the victims of her attack, standing in the back of the crowd and bearing witness to grief that she had caused. She listened as names were read aloud and candles were lit and tears were shed by people who still carried the weight of loss after all these years. She did not speak at these ceremonies because she had no right to intrude on their sorrow, but she was there and she remembered, and she let the pain of what she had done settle into her bones where it would stay forever. Some humans began to nod at her when they passed in the street, a small acknowledgement of her presence that meant more than any grand gesture ever could. Others invited her to share meals with their families, feeding her strange human food and asking her questions about her life. Before the war, she told them about her childhood in the crystalline cities of Vathra Prime and about her training as a military officer and about the beliefs she had been raised with that now seemed so hollow and wrong. They listened without judgment and asked more questions and shared their own stories in return. Slowly, Lyris began to understand what the humans had been trying to show her all along. One afternoon in her 5th year on New Harvest, a small girl approached her while she was working in the fields. The child was perhaps 7 years old, with dark curly hair and bright eyes that held no fear or hatred. "My name is Esperanza," the girl said in a voice that rang like a small bell, "and my grandmother told me I should give you this." She held out a single flower, a delicate purple bloom that grew wild in the fields around the colony. Lyris knelt down to accept the gift with trembling hands because she knew what this flower meant. "Your grandmother," she said carefully. "Does she know who I am and what I did?" "Yes," Esperanza replied with a serious nod. She says you are the one who killed my mommy and daddy before I was born. The words hit Lyris like a physical blow, and she nearly dropped the flower as pain lanced through her heart. I am so sorry, she whispered. And for the first time since the war ended, tears began to fall from her eyes. Grandmother says that being sorry is not enough, Esperanza continued. But she also says that people can change, even the bad ones, if they really try. The little girl smiled at her with innocent kindness that Lyris did not deserve. She says you are trying, Esperanza said, and that is why she wanted me to give you the flower. Then the child ran off to play with her friends, leaving Lyris kneeling in the dirt with tears streaming down her face and a purple flower clutched in her hands. She wept for the parents that Esperanza would never know she wept for. The 3,000 lives she had ended with, counted with the 3,000 lives. 1,000 lives she had ended with a single order. She wept for the monster she had been and the person she was struggling so hard to become, and somewhere in that moment of grief and grace, Lyris Vian finally understood why the humans had not killed her when they had every right and reason to do. So they had wanted her to feel this weight. They had wanted her to know what she had taken from the universe. They had wanted her to spend the rest of her life carrying the burden of her crimes while trying every single day to be worthy of the mercy she had been shown. And Lyris realized that this was a far greater punishment and a far greater gift than death could ever be. 20 years had passed since the end of the war, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted when the first human ships emerged from faster-than-light travel to face the Vathran. Empire Ambassador Lyris Vian stood in the great chamber of the Galactic Concord, her silver wings catching the light of a dozen different suns that streamed through the massive windows surrounding the assembly hall. She was old now by Vathran standards. Her once golden scales faded to a softer shade of bronze, and her eyes, carrying the weight of decades filled with grief and growth and hard-won wisdom. She was also the first member of her species to ever hold the title of ambassador, appointed not by her own people, but by the United Nations of Earth itself. When that appointment had been announced 15 years ago, the galaxy had reacted with shock and disbelief that bordered on outrage. How could the humans give such an honor to someone who had committed such terrible crimes against their own kind? But the humans had explained their reasoning in their usual calm and patient way. They wanted Lyris to serve as a living symbol of what was possible when mercy and justice worked together instead of against each other. They wanted the galaxy to see that redemption was not just a word, but a reality that could be achieved through years of genuine effort and sincere change, and they wanted Lyris to tell her story to the thousands of species who still did not understand what made humanity different from everyone else in the cosmos now. She stood before 1,000 delegates from across known space, all of them watching her with expressions that ranged from hostility to curiosity to something that might have been hope. You have asked me to explain why humanity is different. She began in a voice that had grown strong and steady over years of public speaking. And you have asked why they did not destroy my species when they had every right to do so. She paused and let her gaze sweep across the vast assembly. I spent many years asking the same questions myself, she continued, and I asked them to every human I met during my journey from war criminal to whatever I have become today. I asked the soldier who bandaged my wounds instead of ending my life on the day my world fell. I asked the doctor who healed me when she could have let me suffer. I asked the lawyer who defended me when he had every reason to want me convicted and executed. I asked the families of my victims, who eventually allowed me to work beside them in the fields that grew where their loved ones had died. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed through because this story needed to be told, and the answer I found was always the same, though it took me many years to truly understand what it meant. She spread her wings slightly, Those wings that had once carried her to war and now served as symbols of a peace she had never imagined possible. Humans believe that what you are does not have to define what you become, she declared, and they have built their entire civilization around this single powerful idea. They call it many different things: the benefit of the doubt, second chances, rehabilitation, redemption, hope. But at its core, it is simply the belief that every conscious being carries the potential for growth and change, even those who have done terrible things. She saw Concord delegates shaking their heads in disagreement and disbelief, their worldviews challenged by concepts they had never encountered before. "I know this sounds impossible to many of you," Lyris acknowledged, "because for 10,000 years my own people believed exactly what you believe now. We believed that the strong must dominate the weak and that mercy was foolishness that led to ruin. We believed that enemies must be crushed completely, or they would rise again to threaten us. We believed that some beings were simply born to rule and others were born to serve. And we were wrong about all of it." She turned to look at the human delegation sitting in their assigned section of the great chamber. Her eyes found Sergeant Marcus Cole, now an old man with white hair and a face lined with age, sitting in his dress uniform with medals covering his chest. Was the same soldier who had knelt in the ruins of her command center and chosen to heal instead of kill, setting in motion a chain of events that had transformed Lyris and eventually the entire galaxy. "Sergeant Cole," she said directly to him while the assembly watched in fascinated silence, 20 years ago you stood over me with a weapon in your hands and every justification in the universe to end my life. I had killed thousands of your people, including children, and I felt no remorse for what I had done. You could have executed me and no one would have blamed you, and the war would have continued as wars always do, until one side was completely destroyed. Instead, you gave me a bandage and a chance to become something more than I was. I've spent every day since then trying to be worthy of that choice you made." She looked back at the assembly with tears forming in her eyes. "That is what this human did," she declared, "and that is what humanity continues to do every single day across the galaxy. They did not shock us because they were strong, for many species are strong. They shocked us because they were kind, not naively or weakly, but deliberately, and with purpose. They chose to build where they could have buried. They chose to teach where they could have punished. They chose to believe that even their worst enemies carried the seed of something better waiting to grow." She let those words hang in the air for a long moment. "That is why the galaxy will never be the same," she concluded. "And that is why I stand before you today as proof that the impossible can become real when someone is brave enough to offer mercy to those who do not deserve it." In the silence that followed, Marcus Cole rose slowly from his seat. Every eye in the chamber watched as the old soldier made his way down the stairs and across the floor toward the podium. Where Lyris stood, he stopped in front of her and looked up into her alien face with eyes that still held the same quiet strength they had carried 20 years ago in the ruins of her homeworld. Then he extended his hand. It was a human gesture of friendship and respect, and Lyris had learned its meaning well over the years she had spent among them. She reached out with her own scaled hand and took his, and they stood there together as the galaxy watched in awed silence. Two former enemies who had become something more, two beings who represented everything that humanity had been trying to show the universe since the day they first reached the stars. And in that moment, the Galactic Concord finally understood the lesson that humans had been teaching all along, that the true measure of a civilization is not how they treat their friends, but how they treat those who have given them every reason to hate. That strength without mercy is just cruelty with better weapons, and that the most powerful force in the universe is not destruction, but the simple, stubborn belief that anyone can change if they are given the chance to try.